The town of Brookhaven, Illinois, was an unassuming place surrounded by vast fields and quiet forests. It was a community where neighbors greeted each other on morning walks, where children rode bikes without fear, and where the occasional barking dog was the most disruptive noise. However, the evening of September 17th proved to be an exception, a rupture in the town's fabric of calm. At approximately 10:45 p.m., Nancy Geller, a retired nurse living alone on Cedar Street, heard a disturbance from across the road. She had been seated in her modest living room, reading under the warm glow of a table lamp. The sound began as muffled shouting, escalating quickly into a series of loud crashes. She froze, listening intently, her pulse quickening as the chaos unfolded. Her eyes instinctively shifted toward the Matthews residence, its illuminated windows flickering with shadows that hinted at violent movement inside. Minutes later, Nancy called 911. Her voice was calm but urgent, detailing the unusual noises and her concern that something serious was happening. Within 10 minutes, Brookhaven's police officers arrived, their flashing lights casting eerie streaks across the quiet suburban street. Detective Marie Klein arrived shortly after, known for her meticulous nature and ability to parse through chaos. She moved with practiced precision as she assessed the scene. The Matthews living room was a disarray of shattered glass, toppled furniture, and, at the center of it all, the lifeless body of Dylan Matthews. Blood pooled beneath his head, seeping into the fibers of the carpet. A broken ceramic lamp lay nearby, its sharp edges glinting under the harsh overhead light. The victim's mother, Lisa Matthews, sat on the couch, her face a blank canvas of shock. Her trembling hands clutched a crumpled tissue, and her tear-streaked cheeks bore the weight of the moment. She appeared disoriented, repeatedly murmuring fragmented explanations about hearing shouting before finding her son unresponsive, as she claimed that the broken kitchen window was evidence of a home invasion. But Detective Klein quickly noticed discrepancies. The shards of glass from the window were scattered outside, not inside, a detail inconsistent with her story. Klein observed the room carefully. The blood patterns on the carpet suggested the body had been moved after the fatal blow. The apparent lack of forced entry contradicted Lisa's claims. Outside, a neighbor, Nancy Geller, provided a vital clue. She reported hearing multiple voices during the commotion and seeing a dark sedan speeding away from the house shortly after the crashes subsided. The crime scene raised more questions than answers. No evidence pointed to an intruder, and the arrangement of objects in the room felt oddly deliberate, as though someone had hastily attempted to obscure the truth. Klein knew from experience that the most obvious answers were rarely the correct ones. This was no random act of violence, but a calculated one, likely rooted in personal connections. As she left the house to review her notes, the beginnings of a complex puzzle started to take shape in her mind. Brookhaven was a town where appearances mattered. Beneath its serene facade lay a tapestry of secrets, unspoken tensions, and complex relationships. As Detective Marie Klein began unraveling the threads surrounding Dylan Matthews' death, the carefully curated lives of the people closest to him started to fray. Dylan Matthews was, by all accounts, the shining star of Brookhaven. At 21, he was a gifted guitarist with dreams of moving to Nashville and making it big in country music. His charm was magnetic, drawing admiration from friends, neighbors, and even strangers. Yet behind his easy smile and confident demeanor was a young man navigating the weight of expectation and family dysfunction. Dylan's relationship with his mother, Lisa Matthews, was particularly strained. Since her divorce, she had leaned heavily on him for emotional support, a burden he carried reluctantly. Lisa Matthews, at 43, was a striking woman whose polished exterior concealed a fragile emotional state. As a real estate agent, she was used to selling perfection to others, yet her personal life was anything but flawless. Her divorce 5 years earlier left her feeling discarded and lonely, especially as Dylan grew more independent. Desperate for connection, Lisa began an affair with someone she should never have turned to. Evan Scott, her son's childhood best friend. Evan Scott, 22, was the polar opposite of Dylan, quiet and unassuming. Evan worked long hours as a mechanic's apprentice at his uncle's garage. While Dylan thrived on the adoration of others, Evan often felt invisible, existing in the shadow of his best friend's charisma. He had long harbored feelings of envy toward Dylan, a resentment that festered over the years. His relationship with Lisa began as a chance to escape his insecurities, but it quickly grew into an obsession. The forbidden nature of their affair fueled his ego and gave him a sense of power, but it also planted the seeds of destruction. Detective Klein pieced together these fragments through interviews and background checks. The most telling insights came from Nancy Geller, whose sharp observations were both insightful and damning. Nancy recounted how Evan had become a frequent visitor to the Matthews household in recent months, often arriving after dark and staying for hours. She had also noticed tension between Dylan and Lisa in the weeks leading up to his death, with loud arguments audible even from her house. Klein's suspicions grew when she reviewed Dylan's social media accounts. Buried among posts about music and road trips were cryptic comments hinting at betrayal and anger. A recent post stood out. "Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who hurt you the most." It was liked by only one person, Evan Scott. The tension deepened when forensic analysis revealed inconsistencies in Lisa's initial account. Blood smears on Dylan's carpet suggested he had been moved post-mortem, while the angle of the fatal blow indicated an attack from behind. The lack of defensive wounds on Dylan's body ruled out a struggle, pointing instead to a calculated act. When questioned again, Lisa's polished demeanor began to crack. Her answers became inconsistent, her eyes darting nervously as Klein pressed her for details about Dylan's recent behavior. Lisa admitted that Dylan had confronted her about something days before his death but refused to elaborate. Her hesitation only added to Klein's suspicions. Meanwhile, Evan's name surfaced repeatedly, not just from Nancy, but from other neighbors who had seen him around the Matthews house. His growing presence in Lisa's life had not gone unnoticed, and the whispers of impropriety were impossible to ignore. Klein added Evan to her list of key persons of interest, knowing that his role in Dylan's life and Lisa's secrets might be the missing link in this unraveling tragedy. The more Klein uncovered, the clearer it became that Dylan's death wasn't a random act of violence. It was deeply personal, rooted in betrayal, obsession, and a tangled web of relationships. The pristine image of the Matthews family was beginning to crumble, revealing a far darker reality beneath. Detective Marie Klein, sitting at her desk in the Brookhaven Police Department, sifted through a growing collection of evidence, reports, and notes tied to Dylan Matthews' death. The case had begun to take on a shape, but the picture was still incomplete. Every detail felt deliberate. Every inconsistency nagged at her instincts. She suspected that the key to solving the case lay in the relationships surrounding Dylan, not in the crime scene itself. Dylan Matthews had been a young man with promise, a local musician whose charm and talent had earned him admiration from the community. Yet his life had been far from perfect. There had been mounting tension between him and his mother, Lisa Matthews, in the weeks leading up to his death. The weight of familial strain, coupled with Dylan's growing independence, had created a rift in their relationship. Detective Klein was determined to uncover the nature of that tension. Lisa Matthews, a polished real estate agent in her early 40s, had been struggling emotionally since her divorce. Outwardly poised and professional, she had carried herself as someone in control. However, her life behind closed doors told a different story. Lisa had found herself drawn into an affair with Evan Scott, a man half her age and a longtime friend of her son. What had begun as a misguided attempt to combat loneliness had morphed into a secret fraught with danger and obsession. Evan Scott, a mechanic's apprentice living in a modest apartment above his uncle's garage, was a stark contrast to Dylan. While Dylan thrived on attention and success, Evan had always lived in his shadow. Quiet and reserved, Evan harbored deep insecurities and a latent envy of his friend's charisma. His relationship with Lisa had given him a sense of importance and validation, but it also fed a growing obsession that blurred the lines between love and control. Klein's investigation took her deeper into these dynamics. Forensic analysis of Dylan's phone revealed a series of text messages between him and Evan. While many of their exchanges seemed friendly, others suggested underlying animosity. One particular message from Dylan, sent shortly before his death, expressed a clear warning. It hinted at conflict and betrayal, fueling Klein's suspicion that their relationship had soured in recent months. Interviews with neighbors offered more context. Nancy Geller, the observant woman who had called 911, noted that Evan had been a frequent visitor to the Matthews home. His late-night appearances had raised eyebrows, especially given Dylan's apparent discomfort with his presence. Nancy also recalled overhearing heated arguments from the Matthews household in the weeks before the incident. She distinctly remembered a third voice during these disputes, a male voice she believed to be Evan's. Klein reviewed Lisa's phone records, which confirmed her involvement with Evan. The messages revealed an intimate connection, growing more urgent as the affair progressed. In one exchange, Evan expressed frustration about keeping their relationship a secret, while Lisa pleaded for discretion. These messages, paired with testimony from neighbors, painted a picture of a volatile situation escalating toward tragedy. Klein also scrutinized Evan's background. He had spent much of his life in Dylan's shadow, overshadowed by his friend's success and popularity. His relationship with Lisa seemed to serve as both an escape from his insecurities and a form of retaliation against Dylan. What had likely started as a thrill for Evan had spiraled into a dangerous fixation. The most telling detail came from forensic analysis of the crime scene. Blood smears on the carpet indicated that Dylan's body had been moved after his death, contradicting Lisa's claim of discovering him where he had fallen. Additionally, the angle of the fatal blow suggested an attack from behind, ruling out the possibility of a spontaneous struggle. These findings, combined with the mounting evidence against Evan, made it increasingly clear that the murder was not random. As the pieces began to fall into place, Klein saw a pattern emerge. Lisa's relationship with Evan had set off a chain reaction. Dylan had likely discovered the affair and confronted his mother and her lover. This confrontation had escalated, resulting in Dylan's murder. The exact details of how and why remained murky, but the motives were becoming evident. Betrayal, jealousy, and obsession had collided, leading to a tragedy that would unravel the Matthews family. Detective Klein knew that the next step would be crucial. She needed to confront Evan directly and push him to explain his role in Dylan's death. The web of secrets surrounding Lisa and Evan was tightening, and Klein was determined to break it wide open. Detective Marie Klein was determined to unravel the truth behind Dylan Matthews' death, and the mounting evidence left her certain that Evan Scott was at the center of the case. The forensic reports provided damning details. The ceramic lamp used as the weapon bore both Dylan's blood and Evan's fingerprints, with the blood spatter indicating that the blow had been delivered from behind. This wasn't a spontaneous struggle, but a calculated, deliberate act. Drag marks on the carpet suggested Dylan's body had been moved after his death, further supporting the theory that the crime scene had been staged. The shattered kitchen window, initially claimed by Lisa Matthews to be evidence of a break-in, was clearly an afterthought. The direction of the glass, scattered outside rather than inside, confirmed it had been broken from within the house. The timeline surrounding the murder began to tighten. Witness accounts placed Dylan alive at 9:30 p.m., and Nancy Geller's 911 call reported the shouting and crashing noises at 10:45 p.m. However, the period in between remained unaccounted for, particularly for Evan Scott. Surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store captured Evan's car heading in the direction of the Matthews residence at 9:45 p.m., but failed to show him returning to his apartment until nearly midnight. This critical gap placed him squarely at the scene during the window of the crime. Digging deeper into Evan's background revealed a portrait of quiet resentment and growing instability. He had always lived in the shadow of Dylan's success and charisma, a fact that had quietly eroded his confidence over the years. While Dylan thrived as the center of attention, Evan's life had been marked by unfulfilled potential and frustration. Co-workers at the auto shop mentioned his recent erratic behavior, noting his short temper and a tendency to withdraw from conversations. A colleague recalled a specific outburst in which Evan complained about being used and discarded, though the details remained vague. These patterns painted a picture of a man whose insecurities had transformed into something more dangerous. Klein turned her focus to Lisa Matthews, whose role in the case remained suspicious. Phone records showed frequent calls and texts between Lisa and Evan, with the volume of communication peaking in the weeks before Dylan's death. On the night of the murder, Lisa had called Evan twice, once at 9 p.m. and again at 10:15 p.m., just 30 minutes before Nancy Geller reported the commotion. The messages between Lisa and Evan were initially warm and intimate, but as the affair continued, the tone shifted to one of tension and desperation. One text from Lisa stood out: "Please don't make things worse. We need to talk." This message, sent hours before Dylan's death, hinted at a growing fracture in their relationship. Klein began to suspect that Lisa knew more than she was letting on, and that her involvement in the events of that night extended beyond her claims of discovering Dylan's body. Additional witness statements provided further context. Nancy Geller, the Matthews' attentive neighbor, described hearing multiple voices during the argument that night, identifying Dylan and Lisa, but also a third, unidentified male voice. Another neighbor reported seeing Evan's car parked partially hidden down the street, its location suggesting an attempt to avoid detection. The pieces began to fit together, each detail tightening the noose around Evan's involvement. Determined to catch Evan in a moment of weakness, Klein ordered surveillance of his movements. Over the next 2 days, officers observed him, exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. He visited the Matthews residence late one night, parking his car in the same concealed spot down the street. For several minutes, he paced back and forth outside the house before abruptly leaving. This unusual behavior hinted at guilt or unresolved emotions tied to the crime. Back at the station, Klein reviewed the forensic evidence, witness accounts, and surveillance footage again. Ensuring she had a comprehensive understanding of the case before confronting Evan, she focused on the staging of the crime scene, the inconsistencies in Lisa's story, and Evan's mounting presence in the Matthews' lives leading up to the murder. Each thread of evidence pointed to an intricate web of betrayal, desperation, and calculated actions. Evan Scott was not simply a suspect. He was a man whose relationships and decisions had set a tragic chain of events into motion. Detective Marie Klein advanced her investigation with unrelenting focus, determined to unravel the truth behind Dylan Matthews' death. The evidence against Evan Scott continued to mount, and Klein understood that a confession would seal the case. To achieve this, she needed to dismantle every shred of Evan's fabricated alibi and force him to confront the weight of his lies. The forensic evidence was damning. The ceramic lamp used as the weapon bore both Dylan's blood and Evan's fingerprints, while the angle of the blood spatter confirmed that the blow had been delivered from behind, indicating a deliberate ambush rather than a spontaneous struggle. Additionally, drag marks on the carpet suggested Dylan's body had been moved post-mortem, contradicting claims that he had fallen where he had been struck. The shattered kitchen window, initially framed as evidence of a break-in, was clearly an attempt to stage the scene. Glass shards lying outside rather than inside confirmed it had been broken from within, solidifying Klein's theory. Klein pieced together a timeline of the night of Dylan's death. At 9:45 p.m., surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store captured Evan's car heading toward the Matthews residence. But no footage showed him returning to his apartment until almost midnight. This absence placed him at the scene during the crucial period. Coupled with witness accounts from Nancy Geller, who reported hearing shouting and crashing glass around 10:45 p.m., the timeline painted an increasingly damning picture. Evan's background added another layer to the narrative. Throughout his life, he had lived in Dylan's shadow, struggling with feelings of inadequacy as his charismatic best friend thrived. Colleagues at the auto shop described recent changes in Evan's behavior: withdrawal, irritability, and occasional bursts of frustration. One coworker mentioned hearing him complain about being used and discarded, though the context had been unclear at the time. These insights provided a psychological profile of a man whose jealousy and resentment had been simmering for years. Lisa Matthews' role remained suspicious. Phone records revealed frequent communication between Lisa and Evan, with calls and texts intensifying in the weeks leading up to the murder. On the night of Dylan's death, Lisa had called Evan twice, once at 9 p.m. and again at 10:15 p.m., mere minutes before the shouting began. Text messages further underscored the complexity of their relationship. Early exchanges were warm and flirtatious, but more recent messages carried an air of desperation. Lisa's final text that evening read, "Please don't make things worse. We need to talk," a clear indication of mounting tension and fear. Additional witness statements tightened the noose. Nancy Geller described hearing 3 distinct voices during the argument on the night of the murder: Dylan's, Lisa's, and another male voice she believed to be Evan's. Another neighbor reported seeing Evan's car parked partially hidden down the street, suggesting an attempt to avoid drawing attention. These details provided critical corroboration of Evan's presence at the scene. Surveillance of Evan in the days following the murder revealed erratic behavior. Late one night, he visited the Matthews residence, parking his car in the same concealed location as before. For several minutes, he paced outside the house, his movements restless and uncertain, before abruptly leaving. This compulsion to return to the scene reflected his growing guilt and unease, further reinforcing Klein's suspicions. Klein built her case methodically, consolidating the forensic evidence, witness accounts, and psychological insights. When Evan was brought in for formal questioning, she wielded this arsenal strategically, presenting each piece of evidence in a deliberate sequence. The timeline, the fingerprints, the drag marks, and the surveillance footage all undermined his claims of innocence. Each revelation chipped away at Evan's composure, exposing cracks in his carefully constructed facade. The forensic analysis of Dylan's injuries delivered the most damning blow. The strike to his head had been precise and calculated, delivered from behind, ruling out the possibility of a mutual struggle. The staging of the crime scene, evidenced by the broken window and blood patterns, further pointed to Evan's involvement. The narrative of an unplanned altercation unraveled completely. Klein introduced the emotional angle, weaving together the psychological dynamics between Evan, Lisa, and Dylan. She framed Evan as a man consumed by jealousy and desperation, driven to protect a relationship that was crumbling under pressure. The text messages between him and Lisa revealed an escalating conflict, culminating in Dylan's death. A voicemail on Dylan's phone, left days before his murder, added further weight. Lisa's voice, pleading and urgent, hinted at the storm brewing beneath the surface. "We need to handle this carefully. He knows Evan. He knows everything." The combination of overwhelming evidence and psychological pressure left Evan visibly shaken. His body language betrayed him: tense shoulders, trembling hands, and rapid, uneven breathing. He was a man cornered, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. Klein observed his unraveling, sensing the moment when denial gave way to internal turmoil. She knew she was close, but Evan remained silent, teetering on the edge of confession. As Evan was escorted out of the interrogation room, his demeanor was one of defeat. His steps were unsteady, his head hung low, and his silence spoke volumes. Klein watched him leave, her mind already turning to the next steps. The case was tightening around him, but questions about Lisa's full involvement lingered. The truth was within reach. But the web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal required further unraveling. The investigation was far from over. Detective Marie Klein felt the case shifting under her feet. The overwhelming evidence pointed to Evan Scott, but the undercurrents surrounding Lisa Matthews suggested something deeper. The tangled relationships, the staged crime scene, and the unresolved tensions within the Matthews family all hinted at a truth more complex than a jealous lover's crime of passion. That truth began to surface when Klein received a call from Paul Grant, a private investigator with information about Dylan's last days. Grant had been hired by Lisa Matthews several months prior, not to track a lover or enemy, but her own son. She had suspected Dylan of hiding something and wanted Grant to observe his movements. Over the weeks of surveillance, Grant documented Dylan meeting a man in his 30s at out-of-the-way locations, often exchanging envelopes. The investigator initially suspected illegal activity, but before he could gather definitive proof, Lisa abruptly terminated the arrangement without explanation. Grant handed over photographs and notes from his surveillance, a detailed account of Dylan's comings and goings. One image showed Dylan seated at a rundown diner with a man whose face was partially obscured. In another, the same man exited the diner and climbed into a car, a black sedan. The vehicle matched the description Nancy Geller had given of the car speeding away from the Matthews residence on the night of the murder. For Klein, this was a critical link. The license plate led to Derek Malloy, a local contractor with a history of fraud, assault, and debt disputes. 2 years earlier, Malloy had been embroiled in a legal battle with Lisa Matthews over botched renovation work on her house. Though the case had been settled out of court, the animosity between them seemed to linger. Lisa's decision to surveil Dylan and her abrupt dismissal of Grant raised new suspicions. Klein began to wonder whether Lisa had known about Dylan's connection to Malloy all along. Klein's questions about Lisa deepened further when Nancy Geller provided new security footage. The grainy video captured a black sedan parked near the Matthews house at 10 p.m. on the night of the murder, long before the reported shouting and crashing sounds. The car's presence complicated the timeline and introduced the possibility that someone else had been inside the house before Dylan's death. Derek Malloy, when questioned, was evasive and defensive. He denied having any connection to the Matthews family and dismissed the photographs of him meeting Dylan as coincidence. However, when confronted with the footage of his car near the Matthews house, Malloy's story began to falter. He claimed he had been visiting a nearby friend, but couldn't provide a name. His agitation grew when Klein mentioned Lisa Matthews, a flicker of anger crossing his face before he composed himself. It was clear that Malloy was hiding something, but Klein needed more to pin down his role. As Klein continued to dig into Malloy's connection to Dylan, the case grew increasingly intricate. Financial records revealed that Dylan had made several cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to his death, amounts that aligned with the envelopes seen in Grant's surveillance photos. The evidence suggested that Dylan might have been paying Malloy for something, though the nature of their arrangement remained unclear. Klein also discovered inconsistencies in Lisa's timeline. She claimed she hadn't spoken to Malloy since their legal dispute, but phone records revealed a brief call between them just a week before the murder. When pressed about this, Lisa grew defensive, insisting the call had been accidental. Her evasiveness only heightened Klein's suspicions. The pieces were beginning to form a disturbing picture. Dylan had been caught in a conflict that involved not just Evan Scott, but also Malloy, a man with a history of violence and a grudge against Lisa. The new information forced Klein to reevaluate the events of that night. The shouting heard by Nancy Geller might not have been a single argument, but multiple confrontations. What if Malloy's arrival at the Matthews house had triggered a chain reaction, escalating tensions between Dylan, Lisa, and Evan? The presence of a third party added a layer of chaos to an already volatile situation. With every revelation, the investigation grew darker and more convoluted. Malloy's involvement suggested that Dylan's death might not have been the result of a single motive, but a collision of hidden agendas and fractured relationships. The timeline of the crime, the actions of the suspects, and the secrets buried in the Matthews family all pointed to a truth far more complex and far more dangerous than Klein had initially imagined. As she pieced together the web of betrayal and deception, Klein felt the case slipping further into shadow. Malloy's presence and Lisa's secrecy hinted at a conspiracy that went beyond the impulsive actions of a jealous lover. The investigation wasn't just about justice for Dylan Matthews anymore. It was about untangling the threads of lies and uncovering a truth that threatened to destroy everyone involved. Detective Marie Klein had uncovered enough to know that the death of Dylan Matthews wasn't a simple crime of passion. The presence of Derek Malloy, a man with a history of violence and ties to both Dylan and Lisa, introduced a volatile element into the case. With mounting evidence of collusion and lies, Klein felt the walls of deceit closing in around her suspects. However, each revelation only deepened the mystery, making it harder to separate truth from fabrication. The forensic team revisited the Matthews house, combing through overlooked details in light of Derek Malloy's potential involvement. One discovery caught Klein's attention: faint shoe impressions on the carpet near the broken kitchen window. The prints were inconsistent with the shoes Dylan or Evan had been wearing that night, suggesting the presence of a third individual. These findings aligned with Nancy Geller's security footage of Malloy's car and his shaky alibi during questioning. Klein also turned her attention to the financial records uncovered in Dylan's account. The cash withdrawals were irregular, each totaling several $100s. Bank timestamps matched the dates and times Dylan was seen meeting Malloy in the surveillance photos provided by Paul Grant. Malloy's reputation for coercion and extortion painted a troubling picture. Was Dylan paying Malloy off to protect someone, or had Malloy been leveraging him for something darker? The investigation took another turn when Klein received a tip from one of Malloy's former associates. The anonymous source revealed that Malloy had been involved in a blackmail scheme several months earlier, targeting clients from his contracting business. This revelation led Klein to a chilling theory. Malloy had been extorting Dylan, possibly over something Lisa wanted to keep hidden. If Dylan had been unwilling or unable to meet Malloy's demands, the situation could have turned deadly. Meanwhile, Lisa Matthews' involvement became harder to ignore. Her defensiveness during questioning, the abruptly terminated investigation into Dylan, and the evasiveness about her interactions with Malloy painted her as more than just a grieving mother. Phone records showed that Lisa had called Malloy just days before the murder. When confronted with this fact, she claimed the call was a mistake, but her voice wavered under scrutiny. Klein decided to confront Lisa with the possibility of Malloy's blackmail scheme. Lisa's reaction was immediate. Her hands trembled, and her face paled. Though she refused to speak at first, the weight of her secrets began to show. Klein pressed harder, using Malloy's history and the photographs of Dylan's meetings to challenge Lisa's claims of ignorance. Eventually, Lisa broke, admitting that she had hired Malloy for discreet help during her divorce. However, she insisted she had cut ties with him after their legal battle over the renovations. Klein didn't believe her. The next breakthrough came from the forensic analysis of Derek Malloy's car, impounded following his questioning. In the trunk, investigators found traces of blood that matched Dylan Matthews' DNA. The discovery shattered Malloy's already fragile alibi and placed him squarely at the scene. When confronted with the evidence, Malloy grew combative, denying any involvement in the murder. His claims grew increasingly erratic, shifting blame between Dylan and Lisa. Klein pieced together a working theory. Dylan's discovery of Lisa's relationship with Evan Scott had created fractures in the Matthews household. On the night of the murder, Malloy's presence added fuel to an already volatile situation. It seemed plausible that Malloy, frustrated with Dylan's inability to meet his demands, had confronted him at the house. The altercation escalated when Evan, already agitated by his jealousy and fear of being exposed, arrived at the scene. Klein suspected that the chaos of multiple motives and simmering tensions had culminated in violence. The final puzzle piece came from an unlikely source. Nancy Geller, once again reviewing her security footage, discovered additional clips from earlier that evening. At 9:30 p.m., before Malloy's car arrived, a figure resembling Evan Scott could be seen approaching the Matthews house on foot. The overlapping timelines of Evan Malloy and Dylan in the same place suggested a confrontation far more chaotic than anyone had initially imagined. Klein now faced a tangled web of motives. Malloy had a financial incentive to coerce Dylan, while Evan's jealousy and obsession with Lisa added a deeply personal dimension. Lisa herself, desperate to shield her secrets, seemed willing to manipulate both men to protect her own interests. Each suspect had a reason to see Dylan silenced, but who had delivered the fatal blow remained unclear. As Klein reviewed the evidence late into the night, a chilling realization struck her. This wasn't a crime born of a single motive or a single hand. The truth she suspected was far more insidious. Dylan's death was the result of colliding agendas and fractured loyalties, each suspect playing a role in a tragedy that none of them could escape. The investigation was reaching its breaking point, but with every answer, new questions emerged. The shadows surrounding Dylan's death grew darker, and Klein knew that the hardest truths were yet to be uncovered. Detective Marie Klein stood at the precipice of the case. The evidence had converged into a tangled web of motives, lies, and desperate actions. Dylan Matthews' death was no longer a simple matter of a single killer and a singular motive. Instead, it was a culmination of colliding agendas that had spiraled into violence. As Klein prepared for the final phase of the investigation, she knew she needed to piece together the fragmented truths into one cohesive narrative. The breakthrough came when the forensic team analyzed Dylan's phone one final time. They uncovered a deleted voice memo, time-stamped hours before his death. In the memo, Dylan's voice was strained, his words clipped with frustration. He mentioned an argument with his mother and referenced both Evan Scott and Derek Malloy. Dylan sounded determined, stating, "This ends tonight. I'm not letting them destroy this family." The chilling recording confirmed what Klein had suspected. Dylan had confronted the secrets surrounding him, and it had cost him his life. Klein turned her attention back to the timeline. At 9:30 p.m., Evan Scott had arrived at the Matthews house on foot, likely intending to speak with Lisa. At 10 p.m., Derek Malloy's black sedan was captured on security footage, parking near the residence. By 10:45 p.m., Nancy Geller had heard shouting, glass shattering, and a car speeding away. Somewhere in those critical minutes, chaos had erupted, leaving Dylan dead and his family's secrets in ruins. The final piece fell into place when Klein revisited Evan Scott for one last interrogation. This time, she presented the full weight of the evidence. The forensic analysis of the crime scene, the overlapping timelines, the voicemail from Lisa pleading for help, and the traces of blood found in Malloy's car. Evan's composure broke entirely. He slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, and began to speak. Evan admitted that he had gone to the Matthews house that night to see Lisa, hoping to convince her to leave Dylan and start a new life with him. Instead, he found Dylan waiting for him. Dylan, who had discovered the affair, was enraged, accusing Evan of betrayal and threatening to expose everything. The argument turned physical, with Dylan shoving Evan against the wall. Evan claimed that Lisa intervened, trying to de-escalate the situation, but the tension only grew. According to Evan, it was at this point that Derek Malloy entered the house. Dylan had been paying Malloy to keep quiet about a secret tied to Lisa, possibly financial or legal. However, Dylan had run out of money, and Malloy had come to collect. Seeing the escalating argument, Malloy joined in, accusing Dylan of wasting his time and threatening both Dylan and Lisa. The situation spiraled into chaos. Evan described the moment when the violence turned fatal. Dylan had tried to stand his ground against Malloy, shouting that he wasn't afraid of him. In response, Malloy grabbed the nearest object, a ceramic lamp, and swung it at Dylan's head. The blow was swift and deliberate, leaving Dylan crumpled on the floor. Evan described the stunned silence that followed, broken only by Lisa's panicked sobs. Malloy, unshaken, instructed Evan and Lisa to help him clean up the scene. Evan claimed that he had moved Dylan's body while Malloy smashed the kitchen window to stage a break-in. Once the scene was set, Malloy left, threatening Evan and Lisa to keep quiet or face the consequences. While Evan's account clarified much of the timeline, Klein knew it was only part of the truth. She brought Lisa Matthews in for a final interview, armed with Evan's confession and the voice memo from Dylan's phone. Lisa, visibly shaken, confirmed much of Evan's story, but revealed an additional layer of complexity. Malloy's leverage over Lisa stemmed from their past legal dispute. He had threatened to expose details about Lisa's finances and personal life, potentially destroying her career and reputation. Desperate to protect herself, Lisa had turned a blind eye to Dylan's dealings with Malloy, hoping the situation would resolve itself. Instead, it had escalated into tragedy. The final confrontation came when Klein brought Derek Malloy into custody. Presented with the overwhelming evidence, Malloy initially denied everything, but his bravado cracked under the weight of forensic findings, witness testimony, and the knowledge that both Evan and Lisa had implicated him. Malloy admitted to striking Dylan, but framed it as self-defense, claiming Dylan had lunged at him first. Klein knew this was a lie. The forensic evidence proved otherwise. But Malloy's admission was enough to solidify his culpability. With the truth finally exposed, Klein reflected on the tragic consequences of the choices made by everyone involved. Derek Malloy was charged with second-degree murder, his prior record ensuring a lengthy sentence. Evan Scott, though not the one who delivered the fatal blow, was charged with obstruction of justice and accessory to murder. His role in the cover-up and his manipulation of Lisa had sealed his fate. Lisa Matthews, devastated and broken, was charged with obstruction and accessory after the fact. Her silence and complicity had played a significant role in the events that led to her son's death. The courtroom proceedings were a spectacle, drawing attention from the media and the small town of Brookhaven. The community, once tightly knit, was now fractured by gossip and judgment. Lisa became a pariah, her polished reputation reduced to ashes. Evan, who had once idolized Dylan as a friend and rival, faced the reality of his own destructive actions. Malloy, the outsider whose greed and violence had ignited the final spark, would spend the rest of his life in prison. For Detective Marie Klein, the case was a grim reminder of the fragility of human relationships and the devastation wrought by betrayal and desperation. Dylan Matthews had been a young man full of promise, but his life had been undone by the secrets and selfishness of those closest to him. Klein visited Dylan's grave once the case was closed, leaving a small bouquet of flowers as a gesture of respect. The truth had been uncovered, but it had come at a cost that no one could ever repay. As Klein walked away from the cemetery, she couldn't help but reflect on the complexity of justice. In the end, everyone involved in Dylan's death had played a role in their own downfall. The tragedy of the Matthews family was not just the loss of a son, but the destruction of trust, love, and humanity that had once held them together. The Dylan Matthews case serves as a stark reminder of how secrecy, greed, and betrayal can unravel even the closest bonds. It reveals the destructive power of unchecked emotions, jealousy, desperation, and fear, and how they can escalate into irreversible tragedy. The case underscores the importance of confronting conflicts honestly and the devastating consequences of prioritizing self-preservation over truth and accountability. Ultimately, it is a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust and the lasting impact of choices made in moments of weakness. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.